Yeah, thanks, Deputy Speaker, and I can assure the previous Speaker that this scheme will survive tough times. As we've heard, this was an initiative of the Rudd government, and so we're obviously proud of it, and we're also proud of these changes that will make it more accessible. But as my veteran colleagues, previous speakers have done, I want to recognise all our serving men and women, those that are still in uniform and those that have served. And I didn't realise, Mr Deputy Speaker, that there was such a 87 RVR mafia in this place.
Indeed, Member for Solomon.
So, in acknowledging one member of this group, the member for Spence, also the member for Menzies, and yourself, Deputy Speaker, I want to recognise all the service of reservists and full-time members of our Australian Defence Force now and into the future, and we hope to fill the ranks of our Australian Defence Force for the times that we face in the future. And this initiative, which Defence rightly calls a retention initiative, is aimed at doing just that, encouraging members to continue serving in the ADF, but also to look after them once they, or to assist them with housing once they move into the reserves or into civilian life more fully. It's an incentive for members to stay in the ADF because the longer they serve, the more entitlement that they accrue, and the longer that they can receive assistance through this scheme. So it really helps Defence families. When a member passes away, the member's surviving partner may apply for the member's benefits under the scheme as well. So even with the death of a member, not only will groups like Legacy wrap around the family, this scheme continues to support them. So it's very important to many people who serve in uniform, and the families and their kids. Since 2008, the scheme has invested in affordable housing for veterans who face difficulties, like all Australians do when it comes to housing. But I think it's important to note that often service men and women's moving around does have a big effect on their ability to get into home ownership. The scheme gives eligible ADF members and veterans a monthly subsidy payment on the interest portion of their mortgage payments for those who purchase their own home. Just as one example from my service, Deputy Speaker, is I was posted to Canberra initially, then to Sydney, to Singleton, to Bonegilla in Victoria, to Wagga in New South Wales, over to Perth, back to Sydney, Timor-Leste, Arnhem Land, as well as other work in security-related roles in the Middle East and elsewhere. So you move around a lot in that vocation, and it does make it difficult. We have a large and growing veteran population, and I think as a nation, to our great shame, often too many veterans can't find any housing at all. Way too many veterans end up sleeping rough or couch surfing with mates, and in fact I'm told, no reason not to believe, that 5,000 veterans will experience homelessness tonight. A 2019 study by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute found that 5.3% of the recently transitioned ADF population are homeless. Now that is an astonishing figure. Consider that the homelessness rate for the general population is a 1.9%. Now that is too high, obviously, as well, and there's many initiatives in this budget that's just been handed down by the Albanese Labor government that goes to assisting housing and homelessness across the spectrum. However, that huge 5.3% is massive and a massive concern, and was in no small part of my motivation to fight so hard in the last term of Parliament to get a Royal Commission into Defence and Veteran Suicide established, because it was clear to me and to so many others in the veterans community that there was a direct link between a couple of things, but medical discharges with suicidal ideation and suicide, but also with homelessness, substance abuse, suicidal ideation and suicide. Now, of course, in my electorate of Solomon, homelessness is much higher than that national average of 1.9%, and I'm proud of the initiatives in the budget to go to that, help alleviate some of that. It was great to have St Vincent de Paul Society down here in Canberra recently. But that same study found that about 2/3 of recently homeless ADF veterans reported being suicidal at least once in the past year. And that's why this Royal Commission was so necessary. That's higher than the still shocking 1/4 of non-homeless ADF veterans who had reported being suicidal. But as I said, obviously a direct linkage there. Deputy Speaker, this concerns us all. I know it would you and any other veteran or member of the Defence and Veterans community. And that's why this bill is so important to me and to so many, and it's been great to hear from those opposite their support of it. I believe it's a great Labor reform that has stood the test of time. And that's why our government committed at the May election that it would boost defence home ownerships by amending the scheme from the 1st of January next year. So that's exactly what this bill does. The bill recognises that housing affordability is one of the biggest issues facing Australia, and it responds to the struggles experienced by veterans during their transition to civilian life that too often end in homelessness. And it helps give those serving defence members and veterans who need it a hand up to buy their own home. The bill reinforces and furthers the Albanese Labor government's commitment to retention in the Australian Defence Force, as I've mentioned, to home ownership for members and veterans, which can be so much more difficult due to the nature of their service and the frequent moves required to meet ADF and our nation's needs. And of course, we've talked about veteran wellbeing. This bill is part of a suite of measures to support veterans and their families, members of the Defence Force, to get into home ownership. It's a good policy. But in my electorate, in closing, Mr Deputy Speaker, of course this policy is so important. But we're actually doing more because we realise the scope of the issue. And that is that we have, and I'm proud of this commitment, establishing some supported housing, not only for veterans, but for members of our first responder community, those that are on the front line every day, whether it be a police officer, an ambulance officer, a fire officer, members of our border protection, people who are serving our country or serving our community in uniform. It will be named after Scott Palmer. Scott Palmer was a commando that was tragically killed in Afghanistan, the only Territorian that was killed in Afghanistan. And like in other places around Australia, we will name our veterans and first responder supported living after someone who paid the ultimate sacrifice for our country. But I think it's worth mentioning why this bill is so important for people in my electorate and other places in the country, and that is that when a defence member separates, they leave one family, and often if they haven't got family in Darwin, in Palmerston, in the rural area, then they can get lost without that family support. So this supported accommodation will wrap around that veteran and assist them as they make that transition into civilian life. Those wraparound services will save lives. I'm proud of them. I'm proud of this bill, and I thank you for your service, Deputy Speaker.